At Dartmouth College, the Ivy League university in New Hampshire, a group of student climate activists called Fossil Free Dartmouth has just published a report titled Investigating Irving. The report takes issue with the Arthur Irving Institute for Energy and Society, a new facility named after the owner of Irving Oil, which operates Canada's largest refinery right here in New Brunswick. The report raises questions about greenwashing and the potential undermining of academic credibility. Dartmouth College established the institute with money from Irving Oil, Arthur Irving, his wife Sandra Irving, their daughter Sarah Irving, and the Arthur L. Irving Family Foundation. The report from Fossil Free Dartmouth states that 1/3 of the institute's advisory board works with the fossil fuel industry, either directly or indirectly. Its members include Sandra Irving, Sarah Irving, Irving Oil President Ian Whitcomb, and ExxonMobil Global Brand Manager Abigail Rodgers. The report calls for Irving Oil and ExxonMobil reps to be removed from the board. It also calls for the building to be renamed and for the college to implement a policy rejecting funds from fossil fuel companies, among other demands. For more on this story, I'm speaking to Maya Bovino and Noor Bukhari, who are members of Fossil Free Dartmouth. They're also co-authors of the report Investigating Irving with Kate Yo. Thank you for joining the NB Media Co-op today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
One thing I would clarify is that in addition to the funders you mentioned, the Institute was funded by a variety of other sources as well. So ultimately, I believe the funding from the Irving family and Irving Family Foundation and the Irving Oil Company was about half of the total amount.
And your research in this 30-page report involved more than 30 interviews with faculty, students, alumni, and staff about the Irving Institute, including the faculty involved in the Energy Institute Task Force and the executive director of the Irving Institute. The report states that Dartmouth is complicit in greenwashing. Could you explain briefly what you mean by greenwashing and how it's taking place in this case, in your view?
I'm happy to start with that one. So greenwashing essentially refers to any kind of PR effort to encourage the public to think of a company that's oftentimes a polluting company as more socially responsible and more sustainable than it is in reality. So specifically at the Irving Institute, how we see that operating is that, by having a name, having essentially the sustainability hub on Dartmouth's campus be named after an oil company, the Irving Oil Company, that really gives the impression that Irving Oil is contributing to new research to accelerate the energy transition. And it gives this name to all of the work that we're doing here at Dartmouth for sustainability, ultimately gets accredited to the Irving Oil Company itself, when in reality, that contrasts starkly with what the Irving Oil Company is doing for transitioning away from fossil fuels, which when you look into their actual actions is they do not currently have a plan to transition their business model away from oil, and they are doubling down essentially on oil production while also explicitly lobbying against efforts for Canada to regulate emissions.
And also, I don't think up until this report, I don't get that many students who are completely aware that Irving Oil is an oil company. So that connection isn't made very clear in students' head. And so when they talk about the sustainability hub and they keep associating it with Irving, one of my big concerns was that they don't really know what transaction Dartmouth is doing right now and what transaction they're engaging in when they engage with the Irving Institute.
The NB Media Co-op did reach out to Irving Oil, but haven't received a response by the time of this interview. A spokesperson for Dartmouth College said in an email that faculty have independence in any research related to the Institute and that this independence was stipulated by the founding gift agreement. And your report does acknowledge that college faculty generally said in interviews that they have full independence in their Irving-funded research. The report, in fact, quotes faculty and students reporting some positive experiences with the Institute. except some incidents involving the faculty seed grant. It says some faculty felt the Irving Institute had a heavy hand in determining their scope of research. Could you talk briefly about the criticisms related to the seed grant and other issues that came up in your interviews?
So I think one big distinction we made throughout our interviews, or one big distinction that we came to understand, is that the seed grants, once they're granted to faculty, according to faculty, are supporting really independent work, and that the Irving Institute doesn't have a hand in determining what those results are, or what results go forward, or how they're presented, and that the Irving Institute only needs to be acknowledged as a funder for within those research, like essentially the ultimate products. That being said, I think that specifically the instances that were mentioned being a little bit more clouded, or as you said, the Irving Institute having a heavier hand, that was in the initial iterations of the seed grant program, and that has since been updated in different ways. And as we mentioned in our report, all of the researchers felt that their research was independent once that money was granted. That being said, we're calling for a fossil-free research policy because of the fact that taking money from the oil company, oil companies in general, introduces the risk for sponsorship bias, which is something that we've acknowledged we don't entirely have the capacity to understand if that's something that has happened at Dartmouth within this instance. But we do know that there are a few main questions that remain unresolved to us. And one of the big ones is, why did Dartmouth look to Irving Oil in the first place for funding? And why was the Irving Institute established as an energy institute when we have a climate crisis? That's a big question that keeps coming up. And, sponsorship bias is something that happens oftentimes at the highest level of research. And so by accepting money from the fossil fuel industry, we're introducing the risk that, even just the focus of research is being directed in a way that might be delaying climate action and the kind of innovative, creative thinking that we need in order to effectively address the climate crisis.
And it's the filtering out of perspectives too. So anyone who's hesitant to engage with the Institute, or just generally, since it's being it's positioned really as a sustainability hub, because so many different things other than the Irving Institute are located in the physical building itself. And so that limits engagement with the perspective that we really need to talk about climate justice, to combat the climate crisis, because people don't necessarily want to engage with something named after a fossil fuel company. And that's really important for Dartmouth to have diverse perspectives. And so it presents itself as an obstacle to engagement as well, in addition to the risk of sponsorship bias and greenwashing.
Your report reviews some of the environmental issues stemming from Irving Oil's operations, including at least 19 accidents classified as environmental emergencies at its facilities in Eastern Canada between 2012 and 2015, as reported by Reuters. The company publishes an annual sustainability report. Irving Oil's latest sustainability report from 2022 states that Irving Oil aims to reduce Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030. Your report indicates that's not enough. Could you talk about what kinds of emission reductions are needed?
So essentially, Scope 1 and 2 refers more to the emissions that come from the production of the product from the company, and any emissions that are from direct operations. Whereas Scope 3 then also takes into account the emissions from the consumption of the product. So essentially, it goes back to that question of, are fossil fuel companies thinking about changing about their business model, which is inherently connected to driving the climate crisis through the extraction and exploration and ultimately the consumption of fossil fuels. And in terms of of what we expect from the fossil fuel industry, like Nor was saying, is like we need to be talking about ultimately a complete shift in business model and a transition away from fossil fuels at every level, from the consumption to the production. And as long as we don't have that acknowledgement, then to us, it feels like it's not going to be a productive transition away from or to alternatives. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the entire concept of like acknowledging scope 3 emissions is just like, it speaks to just a misalignment in the scientific consensus on climate change and the recommendations of the IPCC reports, for example. And so to have those companies then, donate money for sustainability hub at Dartmouth, even though it's an energy institute, that is why greenwashing is just so concerning.
The advisory board of the Irving Institute includes, as mentioned, members of the Irving family and the president of Irving Oil, as well as the global brand manager for ExxonMobil, which is one of the world's major oil companies. Talk briefly about the significance of ExxonMobil's presence, in particular, on this advisory board.
The person who is on the advisory board for ExxonMobil is the global brand manager of ExxonMobil. So this is the person responsible primarily for ExxonMobil's public perception. And so it's not just the fact that you have ExxonMobil, one of the world's biggest oil companies, who has helped feed climate disinformation. This is the brand manager of ExxonMobil on the advisory board. And even though we can't say that the advisory board is directly, steering the Irving Institute, they do have influence. They do advise. They do have, a role to play in that. And so when you have the global brand manager of Exxon on the board, that is deeply, deeply concerning.
I would also add that, one of the things we looked at was what programs the Irving Institute supports. And one of note is the energy immersion trips that have visited the Gulf Coast and various other places in the United States that are key topics or key points for, energy and the energy transition. And so when we looked into that and different students' experiences with these immersion trips, one of them, with the Gulf Coast specifically, they did visit the headquarters of Exxon. And when we dug a little bit deeper, we found that idea to visit the Exxon headquarters was proposed by Abigail Rodgers herself from the advisory board. And there's differing opinions on whether it's a good thing to visit these headquarters, because on the one hand, it does, open up the doors for conversations and between students who may be of the opinion that we need to transition away from the fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel industry themselves. So yes, this can be a very enriching experience. But also we found that in communications through or communications regarding this immersion trip, a lot of the wording about these visits was not critical of the fossil fuel industry, but instead sort of sharing the rhetoric that was coming from the fossil fuel industry. So that's very concerning to me, because I think that, yes, it's important to foster this kind of dialogue between the fossil fuel industry and critics of the fossil fuel industry, but do so in a way that prepares students and prepares the people who are engaging in these kinds of opportunities, prepares them with a critical lens and to understand the historical context of Exxon being one of the leading companies that has fed climate misinformation throughout the past 50 plus years.
Youth from the climate movement here in Canada and internationally are calling on universities to pull their multi-million-dollar endowment funds from fossil fuel companies, part of an effort to pressure institutional investors around the world more broadly to move trillions out of fossil fuels. Could you talk briefly about the situation at Dartmouth with respect to these calls for divestment?
So I believe Dartmouth did agree to divest from fossil fuels. I think the plan to divest isn't made as clear, but Dartmouth did agree to divest ultimately. The next phase at educational institutions is disassociation, right? So not having research partnerships with fossil fuel companies, not using fossil fuel funding for climate research. And all of these are really important. And also not allowing our universities to be complicit in greenwashing. And so there's a movement of a lot of other universities around the world for this association. There is already a dissociation policy at Princeton. So divestment and disassociation, I think, work hand in hand to make sure educational institutions aren't complicit in the climate crisis, but also for that public pressure, I think.
I do think it's important to mention that here at Dartmouth, just last week, we had a climate justice rally on Friday. And after that rally, in a separate action, 2 students were arrested in front of the administrative building for essentially the charges were for trespassing, but they were engaging in nonviolent direct action, nonviolent protest, and they had set up a tent in front of the administrative building to propose their own set of demands for the administration to take accountability, take action on various, demands that have been presented to the administration throughout the past decades. And so I think at Dartmouth, we're navigating in a very tense and unsure situation right now, where it feels like our rights to express concern about the world and how our universities are contributing to major global issues, that these attempts to raise these concerns are being suppressed and silenced at a time when our administration also is contradictorily advocating for free speech. And so I guess I don't know exactly what this means for Fossil Free Dartmouth or for students going forward, student organizers going forward at Dartmouth or across the nation, but it is concerning to be operating in this current situation.
I would also add that President Bylock and the president's office at Dartmouth, they released a statement justifying the arrests that painted these students as violent because of, quote, written threats of physical action. And that was really concerning to me, because physical action, as a term used, to talk about nonviolent protest that is visible on campus, and then the administration turned that into a violent threat. And so that's kind of the atmosphere that we're in right now. That's a really dangerous precedent. And so, I hope Dartmouth, works to ensure that students can't feel this way anymore, and that students feel free and open to engage in nonviolent protest and visible physical action.
Well, I've been speaking to Maya Bovino and Noor Bukhari, members of Fossil Free Dartmouth. They're also co-authors of a new report called Investigating Irving with Kate Yo. Thank you for joining the MB Media Co-op today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Well, for more on this, I'm speaking to Erin Stoiter, professor of sociology, specializing in critical media studies at Mount Allison University. Thanks for joining the NB Media Co-op today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Professor Stoiter, you're noted as a critic of the Irving family's political and economic power. Do you see the Arthur Irving Institute for Energy and Society as an example of greenwashing?
Yeah, I certainly do. I see the way that this donation to make them part of academia and to be funding research and cultivate student engagement, while also having a very overt agenda for pursuing, sort of profits through the oil industry, is very much intended to try to bring more people into their story and for them to be able to create a positive image and to kind of wrap themselves in a mantle of research and evidence and sort of the future of young students and sort of energy leadership to mask kind of the pretty dirty oil story that is where the wealth comes from.
Speaking of wealth, company owner Arthur Irving has a net worth currently estimated at $5.8 billion, according to Forbes magazine. His brother James K. Irving, who owns the conglomerate known as JDI, which includes trucking, forestry, shipbuilding, frozen foods, and other business sectors, has a net worth estimated at $5.4 billion. That puts them among the richest people in the world. The Irvings, of course, are also known for their philanthropy here in New Brunswick. It's commonplace to see the Irving name associated with their donations. Examples include the Irving Ambulatory Care Center at the Moncton Hospital, sponsored by Robert Irving, another member of the Irving family dynasty. St. Thomas University in Fredericton recently announced new scholarships funded by Irving Oil and the Arthur Irving Family Foundation. The list really goes on. What's the role of this kind of philanthropy in society, in your view?
Well, it's certainly a benefit. Obviously, these are good things to have money coming from wealthy, organizations in areas of need. And you definitely don't want to say, we don't want your money, but they use this intentionally in order to kind of create a positive association with them, and then to kind of marginalize criticisms of them, to sort of undermine movements that would question or have inquiries about the nature of the industries that they're in, the amount of wealth that they're able to accumulate without perhaps paying their due taxes, the sort of long-term lifetime consequences of the industries that they're in for people's health or for the environment. If the story then becomes about the very nice thing that they donated to, if so a fair taxation system could have easily paid for all of those things and many more. And if they also didn't have a monopoly on the sector, there would be dozens more entrepreneurs who would be in the sector who would also be able to contribute to philanthropy. But they are very against having competitors flourish in any of their fields of dominance, and so they then get to be the one who's the only one with the amount of wealth to create the largesse. And it is very distracting. It's hard to raise a critique about them when other people will say, well, but look at all the nice things they did. Well, yes, they did do those nice things, but that doesn't mitigate the harm that they've done. It is certainly beneficial to them to kind of want to put this good news story out. And many philanthropic organizations will actually spend more on promoting all the good things they do than maybe even actually spending money on good things. It's very important to them to have a brand with a positive identification, as opposed to one maybe connected to the truer cost of what their company's doing.
Mm-hmm. We have reached out to Irving Oil for comment, but they haven't responded at the time of this interview. The NB Media Co-op also reached out to Dartmouth College, which provided a statement. It said in part that Dartmouth faculty have independence in any research related to the institute as stipulated by the founding gift agreement. The report from Fossil Free Dartmouth acknowledges that Dartmouth faculty largely said they have full independence in their Irving-funded research. However, the report calls sponsorship bias a risk the university must take into account. Do you see sponsorship bias of this kind as a risk for universities?
Yes, I certainly do. And there have been many policies that have been developed over time to try to address this. There can be quite a significant damper on freedom of research and freedom of expression if the donor, basically, has a large presence either through direct approving of things, but also there's a general culture in which you sort of know what kinds of projects are going to be funded and what kinds of projects would be frowned upon and that you wouldn't expect to get a renewal of your grant or something like that. And so you end up getting a lot of happy news or distracting or research that doesn't address fundamental questions when you have researchers who are dependent on their financial support for their research projects, basically, in a gatekeeping type role. And people don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. That's a very natural dynamic that takes place. And there's been several terrible stories of, inappropriate influence by donors in these types of situations. And so we have, there've been cases where pharmaceutical, testing has gone on past the point that the researcher felt was safe, because they were under so much pressure from the pharmaceutical company to not reveal that actually this drug wasn't working, let alone causing harm. So we do have a lot of good models of policies in place to try to create a sort of a wall between a donor and between the research. But it sounds like from the inside stories at Dartmouth that this is not the perception and reality.
In the context of the global climate crisis, what's the significance of this kind of bankrolling of an energy institute at an elite academic institution?
I think the students are really recognizing that this is a situation that cannot carry on. We have had so much enabling of the sort of petro industries, and so much delay and denial, that we have lost decades of our ability to roll back and remediate the situation. And we are really like coming to a point of no return that the young people have really understood and taken the mantle on. And this type of continuing to put a happy face on an industry that needs to stop in its track and pivot away to a different type of energy system, this is all causing like harm that we may never recover from. The situation is urgent, and the young people are recognizing that, but unfortunately the funders and their allies do not.
Anything else to add about this story?
Well, there's a lot of facilitation of donors of this level within universities and research institutes and think tanks, and their money like gives them a lot of opportunities to kind of set agendas, set curriculum, set research agendas, set the tone, set the standards of leadership. And it's not without consequence. They're doing it for a reason, and the students are protesting it for a reason. And I think we should pay close attention to what the students inside the institution are saying.
Well, thank you, Erin Stoiter, Professor of Sociology at Mount Allison University, for speaking to us today. I'm David Gordon Koch. Thanks for tuning in to the NB Media Co-op.